The air inside the palace's communications wing was heavy, as though the very walls knew they were about to hold a secret they could not contain for long. Outside, gray London clouds loomed over Westminster, mirroring the mood of a nation about to hear news they never thought would leave the lips of Parliament. It was late afternoon when the first whispers began, just small ripples in the crowded hallways of the House of Lords. By nightfall, those whispers had swelled into a tidal wave, and by the next morning, the world was staring at a headline that seemed to stop time. Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, stripped of all royal titles and privileges. For many, it felt like the final chapter in a story that had long since stopped being a fairy tale. But for others, it was the moment they had been waiting for, a reckoning years in the making. It wasn't just the decision itself that stunned people, but how quickly it happened once the machinery of British governance set itself in motion. The petition that led to this historic act was not the sort of thing that could be easily ignored. Filed by members of the House of Lords and backed by a coalition of parliamentary voices, it cut straight to the heart of royal tradition and national identity. It challenged not only Meghan's place in the royal family, but the very idea of who should be allowed to hold titles bestowed by the crown. And when it passed, it carried a weight that shook Buckingham Palace to its foundations. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you have to step back in time. You have to remember the day in May 2018 when the world watched Meghan walk down the aisle of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, wearing a Givenchy gown and a shy, determined smile. She was not just marrying a prince. She was stepping into an ancient institution with centuries of rules, protocols, and unspoken expectations. People talked about the symbolism: an American actress, a biracial woman, joining one of the most traditional families in the world. It was hailed as a modernizing move for the monarchy, a moment of progress. Back then, no one could have imagined that within a few short years, Parliament itself would vote to erase her royal standing entirely. The cracks began to show early. Meghan's relationship with the British press deteriorated almost immediately after the wedding. Reports emerged of tensions between her and palace staff, of disagreements over protocol, of whispered feuds with other senior royals. To her supporters, these were signs of a woman being unfairly targeted and held to impossible standards. To her critics, it was evidence that she was unwilling to adapt to the role she had taken on. The Megxit crisis of early 2020, when she and Prince Harry announced they would step back from royal duties, turned that growing divide into an unbridgeable chasm. From that point on, her royal status seemed increasingly at odds with her public image, a global celebrity who had left the palace behind, yet still carried the titles and privileges that came with it. What happened next was not an overnight reaction. It was the product of years of tension, of private meetings between senior members of Parliament, of growing discontent among those who believed royal titles should be tied to service, loyalty, and a sense of duty. The House of Lords had been here before, in other eras, when titles were questioned or withdrawn. But those were different times, with different stakes. In this case, the debate was not just about decorum. It was about the image of the monarchy in a modern, highly scrutinized world. Could a duchess who openly criticized the institution still benefit from its highest honors? Could Parliament look the other way when so much of the public believed the integrity of the system was at risk? The introduction of the petition was theatrical in its own right. The Lords, known for their deliberate pace and measured speech, were suddenly the setting for something far more intense. Statements were read aloud that referenced not only Meghan's public actions, but her interviews, her media ventures, and the perception of her abroad. There were warnings about precedent. If titles were left untouched, what message would that send to future royals who might want to distance themselves while still holding on to the benefits? The atmosphere was tense, but oddly resolute. This was not a casual debate. This was a decision that would echo through royal history. While the petition was being discussed, Buckingham Palace remained publicly silent. But behind closed doors, sources described a storm of activity. Advisors scrambled to prepare contingency plans. Legal teams reviewed the Crown's authority versus Parliament's, and senior royals were briefed in private meetings. The Queen's absence from these proceedings, due to her passing and King Charles now reigning, meant the final call would rest in a very different dynamic. And Charles, it was said, had long been conflicted about Meghan's place in the institution. His own coronation had been marked by carefully managed appearances, an effort to present a united front. But this decision risked shattering that image. For Harry, the decision was more than political, it was personal. Stripping Meghan of her titles meant, in effect, acknowledging that the royal family no longer considered her one of their own. It would impact not only her identity, but potentially the standing of their children, Archie and Lilibet. Though the parliamentary petition focused narrowly on Meghan, everyone knew the implications could extend much further. Would their children still be considered prince and princess? Would security arrangements change? Would this lead to more legal wrangling over property, travel, or even inheritance rights? The questions swirled, and Harry's silence became one of the most talked-about aspects of the unfolding drama. When Parliament's approval finally came, it was swift and decisive. The motion passed with a majority that left little room for misinterpretation. The announcement was formal and restrained, carefully worded, avoiding personal attacks. But the underlying message was clear. The privileges and titles associated with the Duchess of Sussex no longer stood. In one stroke, the position she had held since her wedding was erased, replaced by the simple fact of her being Meghan Markle once again. The legal language was tidy, but the symbolism was seismic. The public reaction was immediate and polarized. Supporters of the decision argued it restored dignity and consistency to the monarchy. They pointed to examples of past royals who had been stripped of honors for less and insisted this was not punishment but preservation. Opponents saw it differently. They viewed it as an act of retaliation, a way to punish Meghan for speaking out and refusing to conform. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags trending on both sides and television panels filling airtime with heated debates. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the move was met with confusion by some and celebration by others, particularly those who saw Meghan as having outgrown the constraints of royal life. But the real story, the one that would unfold over the coming weeks and months, was not just about the parliamentary vote. It was about the aftershocks. The strain this would put on Harry's relationship with his family, the impact on the monarchy's image globally, and the personal toll on Meghan herself. In private, friends claimed she was both furious and hurt, seeing the move as proof that she would never truly be accepted. Publicly, her team released a carefully crafted statement emphasizing her ongoing commitment to humanitarian work, avoiding direct engagement with the decision. The gap between her public persona and the palace's stance had never been wider. This is where the story truly begins, not in the halls of Parliament or the chambers of Buckingham Palace, but in the collision between personal ambition, public duty, and the weight of centuries-old tradition. The stripping of Meghan Markle's royal titles is not just a headline. It is a turning point in the ongoing saga of the modern monarchy. It forces uncomfortable questions about loyalty, legacy, and the price of independence when tied to one of the most famous families in the world. And as the dust settles, one thing is clear. This is not the end of the Meghan Markle story. It is the start of its most unpredictable chapter yet. The story of how the petition that would ultimately change the course of Meghan Markle's royal life came to be is as layered as it is contentious. It began quietly, without fanfare, months before the public had any inkling that such a move was even being considered. The House of Lords is not known for impulsive gestures. It is a place steeped in measured debate and traditions that stretch back centuries. Yet somewhere deep within those walls, conversations started to take shape about the legitimacy of retaining royal titles when one no longer serves the crown in any capacity. The whispers began in private dining rooms, during casual exchanges between peers, over coffee cups, and under the dome of hushed, echoing corridors. At first, it was nothing more than idle speculation. What would happen if Parliament decided to intervene? But the longer those questions lingered, the more they evolved into a strategic plan. The momentum came from a small but influential group of peers who believed that the integrity of the monarchy was at stake. For them, the royal title was not just a courtesy. It was a public trust, a recognition that came with responsibilities to the nation and the Commonwealth. In their view, Meghan had abandoned those duties the moment she stepped away from official royal life and moved across the Atlantic. Her continued use of the Duchess of Sussex title, especially while engaging in commercial ventures and media productions that often cast the royal family in an unflattering light, was more than a matter of etiquette. It was, they felt, a breach of principle. These lords were not driven by personal dislike, at least not outwardly. They spoke of precedent, of maintaining the respect of the institution, and of avoiding a slippery slope where titles could be kept indefinitely without any service attached. The petition itself was drafted with surgical precision. Every line was weighed for legal strength and public defensibility. It began by affirming the value of the monarchy as a constitutional institution, grounding the argument in the history and tradition of title grants. It then moved to the specific case at hand, outlining Meghan's departure from royal duties, her relocation, and her ongoing commercial endeavors. There were no inflammatory adjectives, no emotional outbursts, just a steady accumulation of facts designed to persuade both the lords and, eventually, the public that this was a matter of fairness and consistency. The language avoided anything that could be construed as a personal attack, framing the move instead as a necessary housekeeping measure for the sake of the crown. Before it was ever tabled in the chamber, the petition underwent rounds of quiet consultation. Legal scholars were discreetly brought in to examine the constitutional boundaries between Parliament's authority and the Crown's prerogative. Historians provided context by revisiting similar cases from the past, such as when royals were stripped of titles during wartime or after scandal. The strategists knew they would need to present this as something with historical precedent, not as a targeted campaign against one individual. All the while, the circle of those aware of the petition's existence remained tight. Leaks would have jeopardized the element of surprise and possibly triggered a counter-effort from Meghan's supporters or even from within the royal household itself. When the petition was finally ready, it was introduced not with the bluster of a political attack, but with the gravity of emotion that touched the very heart of the nation's identity. The peer who tabled it spoke in calm, deliberate tones, drawing on centuries of parliamentary tradition to frame the argument. His opening remarks spoke of duty, of the delicate balance between privilege and service, and of the need for titles to be more than ornamental. He acknowledged the personal nature of the case, but insisted that the principle must come first. Every sentence was crafted to sound less like a punishment and more like an act of guardianship over the monarchy's future. Once the petition was formally lodged, the response within the Lords was telling. Some peers nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening with resolve. Others shifted uncomfortably, wary of the optics of singling out a former royal by name. There were murmurs about the possible diplomatic fallout, particularly in the United States, where Meghan and Harry's popularity with certain segments of the public remained strong. But for the petition's backers, the risk was worth taking. They argued that the longer Meghan retained her titles while living a life wholly separate from royal duties, the more the public would question the relevance and accountability of the system itself. Behind the scenes, word of the petition's existence began to circulate through political and media circles, though details remained scarce. A handful of journalists got wind of it, but without confirmation from official sources, they could only hint at what might be coming. In the palace, however, the news landed with more force. Advisors knew that if the petition gained traction, it could put the king in an awkward position. If Parliament passed it, he would be expected to act, or risk appearing to defy the will of the legislature. For Charles, who was still carefully navigating the early years of his reign, the potential for a public clash with Parliament was something to avoid at almost any cost. The build-up to the petition's first debate in the chamber had a tension all its own. On the day it was scheduled to be heard, the Lords gathered in their ceremonial robes, but the air was anything but routine. This was not the kind of debate that could be approached with detachment. Everyone knew it would be closely watched by the press and dissected by royal commentators for weeks afterward. The peer presenting the petition once again spoke with the steadiness of someone who understood the historical weight of the moment. He did not sensationalize. He simply laid out the case, step by step, until it was impossible not to see the logic in his words. As the first responses came in, it was clear the room was divided. Those in support of the petition emphasized the importance of aligning titles with active service and loyalty to the crown. Those against it warned of setting a dangerous precedent. arguing that the move could be seen as punitive and might erode public trust rather than strengthen it. Some raised the point that Meghan's departure from royal life had been negotiated in 2020, with terms agreed upon by both sides, and questioned whether revisiting those terms now was fair. But each counterpoint was met with a rebuttal grounded in the petition's central theme. Titles are not mere souvenirs of one's time in the royal family. They are an ongoing representation of the monarchy itself. By the end of the initial debate, the petition had done exactly what its architects intended. It had framed the question not as one of personal grievance, but as a matter of constitutional integrity. It now had momentum, and while more rounds of discussion and scrutiny lay ahead, those in the know could already feel which way the wind was blowing. The palace, Parliament, and the public were all moving toward a confrontation that could no longer be sidestepped. What began as a whisper in the corridors of the Lords had now become a matter of national consequence, and every passing day brought Meghan Markle one step closer to losing the titles that had once defined her place in history. The transition from a celebrated royal bride to a figure at the center of one of the monarchy's most polarizing controversies was not a sudden fall, but a slow, visible unraveling. In the beginning, Meghan Markle's entry into the royal family carried the weight of symbolism. She was a successful actress, a self-made woman who had built her own career and name long before marrying Prince Harry. Her mixed heritage and American background were seen by many as a breath of fresh air in an institution often criticized for being too insular, too bound by centuries-old tradition. The wedding itself was broadcast to millions across the globe, with moments carefully chosen to blend royal protocol with personal touches that spoke to her identity. The day was supposed to mark a turning point, the dawn of a modern monarchy that could embrace diversity without losing its sense of continuity. Yet even during those early months, there were faint warning signs that this fairy tale might not endure. Reports began surfacing of disagreements between Meghan and palace staff, whispers of a demanding working style and frustration over restrictions on her public role. At first, these were brushed aside as teething problems. Any new member of the royal family would need time to adjust. But the British tabloid press, known for its relentless appetite for royal drama, seized upon every rumor, every perceived breach of tradition, and amplified them into headlines that dominated front pages. Small incidents, like a comment about a tiara choice or an adjustment to a royal schedule, became magnified into symbols of deeper tensions. By the time Archie was born, the relationship between Meghan and the British press had deteriorated beyond repair. Coverage became increasingly adversarial, with stories portraying her as both an outsider unwilling to adapt and a disruptive force within the family. Meghan's supporters countered by pointing to examples of double standards in the way she was treated compared to other royal women, arguing that race and nationality played undeniable roles in the hostility she faced. The palace maintained its customary silence, adhering to the never complain, never explain ethos, but behind closed doors, the strain was evident. Meetings were held to address the growing rift between the Sussexes and the institution, but the gap only widened. The breaking point came in January 2020 when Harry and Meghan announced, without prior approval from the palace, that they would step back as senior royals and seek financial independence. The statement, posted online for the world to see, caught senior royals off guard and triggered an emergency summit at Sandringham. For the first time in living memory, a senior royal couple had effectively resigned from the institution, and the monarchy was forced to navigate uncharted waters. The terms of their exit included the loss of their HRH styles and day-to-day use and the cessation of official royal duties, but they retained their Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles. This compromise was meant to allow them to maintain a symbolic link to the family while giving them the freedom they claimed to need. However, the years that followed saw Meghan and Harry embark on a path that repeatedly intersected with, and often clashed against, the monarchy's carefully curated image. High-profile interviews, such as the one with Oprah Winfrey, contained allegations that shook the palace to its core. Claims of racism within the royal household, discussions about mental health struggles, and frank criticisms of the firm were broadcast to millions, sparking both sympathy and outrage. For Meghan's supporters, she was a courageous truth-teller exposing the harsh realities of royal life. For her critics, She was undermining an institution that had welcomed her and given her a global platform. Commercial ventures added another layer of complexity. Multi-million-dollar deals with streaming platforms, book projects, and public speaking engagements blurred the line between personal enterprise and the prestige conferred by royal titles. Each time Meghan was introduced at an event as the Duchess of Sussex, debates reignited over whether it was appropriate for someone who no longer served the crown to leverage that association for personal gain. This was the core argument that began to resonate in political circles and among members of the House of Lords, the idea that titles were being used in a context that served neither the monarchy nor the public, but rather the individual holding them. Meanwhile, the relationship between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family remained strained. Public appearances together were rare and often marked by visible awkwardness. Behind the scenes, trust had eroded to the point where private conversations were tightly guarded for fear of leaks. Meghan's decision to attend certain high-profile events while skipping others fueled speculation about ongoing disputes. Harry's memoir, with its candid accounts of family tensions, only deepened the divide. Each revelation became another brick in the wall, separating the Sussexes from the institution they had once been central to. For Parliament, these developments provided a mounting case for action. By the time the petition in the House of Lords was drafted, there was a well-documented history of Meghan's public departure from royal life and her subsequent activities that could be used to justify the move. Supporters of the petition pointed to the contrast between her role as a working royal and her life now, arguing that the disconnect was too great to ignore. The issue was no longer just about public relations. It was about the integrity of the monarchy as an institution in the eyes of both the British public and the Commonwealth. The fallout from this period was not only institutional, but deeply personal. Meghan had gone from being hailed as a transformative figure within the monarchy to being at the center of a formal parliamentary action to strip her of her titles. The journey from her wedding day to this point was marked by moments of triumph, disillusionment, and open conflict. Each step along the way had contributed to a narrative that Parliament could not easily overlook, and each controversy had chipped away at the case for allowing her to retain the symbols of a role she had left behind. The petition might have been the trigger, but the decision to move forward with stripping Meghan of her royal titles was rooted in a series of moments that, when placed together, painted a picture of a relationship between the Duchess and the monarchy that had gone beyond repair. The breaking point was not a single explosive scandal, but a collection of actions, statements, and public moves that, in the eyes of many within the institution and Parliament, crossed a line from independence into open defiance. This slow accumulation of tension created a climate in which decisive action was no longer viewed as optional, but as inevitable. One of the most significant turning points came in the wake of the couple's televised interview with Oprah Winfrey. It was not just the content of the conversation, though that was damning enough in the eyes of the palace. It was the global reach and emotional impact of what was said. Meghan spoke openly about her struggles with mental health and feelings of isolation, alleging that pleas for help were ignored by the institution. She hinted at discriminatory attitudes within the royal household, and while she stopped short of naming names in certain instances, the implication was enough to ignite a storm of commentary. For the monarchy, which thrives on discretion and the careful control of public image, the airing of such grievances to an audience of millions was viewed as a deep breach of the unspoken pact between the royals and the crown. The interview became a dividing line. Supporters lauded Meghan for her honesty and courage, while critics accused her of waging a public campaign against an institution that had conferred upon her one of the highest honors it could bestow. Parliamentarians who would later back the petition began quietly taking note of the contradictions between Meghan's claims of seeking privacy and her participation in globally broadcast media events. In their view, such moves blurred the distinction between personal catharsis and the calculated use of royal identity for influence and opportunity. Tensions deepened when the Sussexes embarked on a series of commercial projects, each carrying price tags in the millions. A multi-year production deal with a major streaming platform, book publishing arrangements, and paid speaking engagements at high-profile conferences were all announced within a short span of time. In isolation, these would have been unremarkable for any public figure, but for a member of the royal family, especially one who had stepped back from duties. The optics were volatile. The persistent use of the Duchess of Sussex title in promotional materials and public appearances became a rallying point for critics. To them, it was evidence that Meghan was trading on royal branding while rejecting the responsibilities that came with it. The publication of Harry's memoir added another combustible element to the mix. Although the book was written in his voice, Meghan's presence loomed large in the narrative. Personal anecdotes, grievances against senior royals, and intimate family moments were laid bare in a way that further eroded the already fragile trust between the Sussexes and the rest of the family. In Parliament, some saw this as confirmation that the couple's royal titles were being used as a shield against criticism while they engaged in activities that could actively harm the monarchy's reputation. Beyond the high-profile interviews and media projects, smaller incidents also chipped away at the perception of Meghan as a former working royal who maintained a respectful distance from the institution. Comments made in podcasts and speeches occasionally strayed into territory that touched on the royal family or British society in ways that stirred political sensitivities. Invitations to high-level events in the United States and abroad were sometimes extended specifically because of her title, and the petition's supporters argued that this influence was precisely what needed to be curtailed. Within the palace, each of these developments was closely monitored, though public comment was rare. Senior aides kept detailed records of media appearances, noting how often her royal title was used and in what context. Reports compiled for internal review outlined patterns of behavior that could be cited in any formal argument for revoking her privileges. The concern was not only reputational but constitutional. While the monarchy is largely ceremonial in modern Britain, the association of titles with certain types of activity could blur the lines between state neutrality and personal enterprise. The final push toward the breaking point came during a series of public engagements in the United States where Meghan was introduced repeatedly as the Duchess of Sussex while speaking on topics that touched indirectly on British governance and policy. Although nothing she said directly violated any legal boundaries, the optics were enough to alarm those who believe the monarchy must remain above even the appearance of political entanglement. These events were seized upon by the petition's architects as clear examples of why retaining the title was untenable. When the petition's language was finalized, it made specific reference to this pattern of public engagement, tying it to broader concerns about the integrity of royal titles. It argued that titles should not be used in contexts that could be construed as partisan or commercial in nature, particularly when the holder had stepped away from official duties. The case was presented not as a punishment for past actions, but as a preventative measure to safeguard the monarchy's credibility. In truth, by the time the petition reached the floor of the House of Lords, the outcome was already leaning heavily toward revocation. The years of controversy had eroded much of the goodwill Meghan had once enjoyed within the institution, and the string of public moves that followed her departure from royal duties gave her opponents ample material to build their case. The breaking point, then, was less a single moment of betrayal and more the culmination of a long and public estrangement, one that had finally reached the stage where Parliament was prepared to act decisively. Inside the House of Lords, debates often carry a kind of ceremonial stillness, a rhythm honed over centuries, but the session in which Meghan Markle's titles were formally considered was charged with an energy that felt different from anything in recent memory. On the morning the matter was set to be discussed, members arrived earlier than usual, some flanked by advisors, others quietly reviewing notes. The red leather benches were polished to a shine, the ornate gold details of the chamber catching the light that filtered through the stained glass. Outside, television crews jostled for the best angles while reporters traded whispers about who might speak and in what order. The air felt tight, expectant, as though everyone present understood that whatever happened inside those walls would ripple far beyond Westminster. The opening remarks were deliberate and almost surgical in their precision. The peer who had introduced the petition began by acknowledging the gravity of the moment, his voice measured but firm. He spoke not of personal grievances, but of the enduring principles that underpin the monarchy's public standing. Titles, he reminded the chamber, were not ornamental trophies, but symbols of service, duty, and loyalty. The question before them was not about affection or animosity toward one individual, but about whether the continued holding of such titles by someone who had voluntarily stepped away from those responsibilities was consistent with the dignity of the crown. The words landed with weight, the kind that draws murmurs in a room otherwise trained to remain quiet. As he laid out his case, the peers cited precedents from British history, moments when titles were withdrawn from individuals who, for reasons ranging from wartime disloyalty to political controversy, no longer aligned with the values expected of them. These examples were chosen carefully, each one illustrating that the step they were considering, while rare, was not without precedent. He also took care to avoid personal attacks, framing Meghan's departure from royal duties and subsequent public career as a matter of incompatibility rather than moral failing. The strategy was clear. Keep the discussion focused on principle, not personality. The floor then opened to responses, and it became evident just how divided the Lords were on the matter. Some stood to support the petition wholeheartedly, their speeches echoing themes of accountability and the need to protect the monarchy from reputational erosion. They argued that the Sussex departure agreement of 2020 had been based on trust that the titles would not be used in ways that might compromise the crown. In their view, events since then had demonstrated that the arrangement was no longer sustainable. Others, however, took a more cautious stance. They warned that removing titles from a living, high-profile royal could set a precedent that might one day be turned against other members of the family in moments of political or public pressure. They spoke of the monarchy's ability to weather criticism without resorting to punitive measures. As the exchanges unfolded, the atmosphere grew heavier. Every speech was met with a kind of restrained attentiveness, the kind that only deepened the tension. Some members used their time to delve into the specific instances that had caused concern. The use of the Duchess of Sussex title in promotional materials for commercial projects, the couple's participation in media ventures critical of the royal institution, and the optics of representing themselves on the global stage while detached from official duties. Others sought to reframe the discussion entirely, questioning whether Parliament should even have the power to compel such a change, given that the granting and removal of titles had historically been the prerogative of the crown. Outside the chamber, the debate was already being dissected in real time. News outlets ran live commentary, with legal experts explaining the constitutional nuances and royal commentators weighing in on what the outcome could mean for the future of the monarchy. Social media was a storm of opinion, hashtags trending on both sides of the issue, with supporters of the petition praising Parliament for defending tradition, while opponents accused it of succumbing to political theater. Back inside, the exchanges continued into the afternoon. One of the most compelling speeches came from a peer who had served in the diplomatic corps. He framed the matter not only as an internal British issue, but as one with international ramifications. Foreign governments, he argued, often perceive titled members of the royal family as informal representatives of Britain, whether or not they hold an official role. Allowing someone who no longer serves the crown to retain such a title while engaging in high-profile international activity could, he warned, create confusion and potentially undermine Britain's diplomatic standing.